We are just going to keep on moving on track in looking at the book of Joel in the month of December. I do want to thank John for filling in for me last week. Heard he did a really good job, and so I appreciate his efforts. But there's always more we can get out of every chapter we look at. And he said, a while ago, he didn't get through all of chapter 14 of Hosea, but that's okay. I mean, we've said what we've said on that book, and we'll just keep going. And Joel is one that I think can still benefit us today. I told you that in one of the classes that what I think God's done throughout the Bible is He's repeated these principles in so many different places for us to see and to benefit from. And as we look at the book of Joel, we'll see the same thing, that it doesn't take long to read it. I mean, you can go read it, at home. But I'll try and highlight some stuff tonight to kind of bring the book to life when we go through it. But my point is, you're going to see things there that still pertain to our relationship with God. So it's, again, the same principles being told throughout the Bible. And before we begin, I'll lead us in a word of prayer, if you would. Our holy God, our Father, we bow at this time to thank you for this opportunity you've given us as your people to be together and to see one another and to gather to open your word and to study it. We do pray that you please bless us in our efforts to see the lessons that you've preserved in your word, especially in the book of Joel, that we can walk closer to you and with a stronger faith in you and with a better understanding of your word. Help us to love you more and to grow in our faith. Please have mercy. Please forgive us where we sin. And thank you so much for making it possible for us to be forgiven through Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, so looking at this book, of course, it all goes back to the time when God's people were divided. We know that the main sections of history for the Old Testament is when God's people were united under the kings of Saul, David, and Solomon, but then they divided into two different kingdoms, and Joel is a prophet who worked in that time frame of when the people were divided. And we know that other prophets came along during the captivity or even after the captivity, but especially Joel's message is definitely dealing with something, a group of people at least, before the captivity occurs. There's debate on when it happened, when he wrote, when he worked, and who his father was as far as Bethuel, that's mentioned in verse 1, and trying to locate who that is, and so on and so. Well, you can spend a long time going through all that and still end up at the very place you started. So, in my mind, it doesn't really matter to put an exact date on it as it does to put him in the right time frame. And what we can see is he is during the divided kingdom, and it's something that happens before captivity takes place. And he's especially focused on the kingdom of Judah. Now, we looked at Hosea. Hosea dealt with Israel. Joel dealt with Judah. And you can look in the book itself and see different references to things that would have been true for God's people at that time. When he makes reference to the priest and the altar and the house of the Lord, as in chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, mention again the house of your God. Consecrate a fast in verse 14. Call a sacred assembly, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Well, Israel didn't have that. They didn't have the house of the Lord. So it seems very reasonable to me that he's talking to the kingdom of Judah. He does make reference to Zion, and that's identified through his work in chapter 2 and verse 1. blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. And we know that that refers to where? I mean, in the Old Testament story, where does it refer to? Zion. Where's that generally pointing to? Well, how about that? I think it goes back to Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's referring to Jerusalem. And so, obviously, that would be in the kingdom of Judah. The congregation and the priests are mentioned, and then he does mention Judah and Jerusalem in chapter 3 and verse 1. Behold, in those days and at that time when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem. So, anyway, again, you'll have some disparity on, when he wrote it as far as the exact date, but we can at least, like I said, see the time frame. Okay, now, in looking at Joel, well, let me ask you before I show the next slide. When you hear the book of Joel, what comes to mind with you as far as even in the story of the Bible? What are some things that come to mind? What's one of the big things that come to mind when you especially open the New Testament? Somebody's whispering, or I'm hearing things, one or the other in my head, which happens, but not normally at this time. It's not normally during this time. Go ahead, Velma. All right, yeah, Peter's sermon. Yeah, Acts 2, there you go. Yeah, to me, that's really the most familiar reference to Joel, is how he goes back to Joel chapter 2 and shows how this was what Joel was talking about in prophesying of the Spirit. Anything else that you can think of with Joel? Okay, well, hopefully by the end of December, going through this on every Wednesday, we can have a little bit more understanding of this book. But yeah, chapter 2 of Joel 2 is repeated in Acts chapter 2 with God telling how he would send his Spirit upon people. And Peter applies that, of course, to the beginning of the church. Now, what you will see in this book is a major reference to locusts and the army of the Lord, and how the locusts were used to judge his people. This is a predominant thought in this book. In fact, it says in chapter 1 and verse 4, what the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten. So you have all these different stages of locusts. And what you see, I came across this and I thought that was a pretty good way of looking at it as far as, trying to remember the meaning of Joel and something from Joel. The acrostic is Judah's overwhelming eating locusts. That's what somebody came up with. And I thought, well, that's pretty good, because these creatures are definitely highlighted in this book, as I'll show you here in a little bit. It's been suggested that the theme of the book is this phrase, the day of the Lord. And you do see this a lot. And so, it seems reasonable to think that that's a major thought that he has. He does mention in 5 different places, the day of the Lord is at hand, the day of the Lord is coming, the day of the Lord is great and terrible, it's awesome, it's near. Okay, so he uses that phrase, and what we see is that other prophets used that phrase when God was about to judge people. And you can see references to that. Like I said, Joel used it 5 times. Chapter 115 plus 4 more times is what that's supposed to mean. But Obadiah, same thing. When he was talking about Edom, he referenced how the day of the Lord was near. Upon all the nations is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you. So the day of the Lord mentioned there. talking about God's judgment on these people. Jeremiah used it. In Jeremiah chapter 46 and verse 10, the day of the Lord, God of hosts, the day of vengeance, that he may avenge himself on his adversaries, so on and so forth. And he was talking about Egypt in that context. So when God was about to judge that nation, the phrase, day of the Lord, was used. And then even in Amos, in talking about the Israelites, not only mentions that phrase, but also refers to something that Joel used in talking about the darkness associated with God's judgment. And you see in Amos chapter 5 and verse 20, in verse 18, the day of the Lord, so on and so forth. In verse 20, it's not the day of the Lord darkness and not light. So that's relevant when you look at this book, this concept. But here's the point I see from this, is that whenever he promised that the day of the Lord was coming, it was referring to a judgment, okay? And we see it happened. When he said it was coming, it was near. You can look and see God did carry out his word, okay? Through these prophets, he warned these people, and eventually it happened, all right? Well, the thing that gets my attention in looking at that is God has said that to us. He's told all of humanity that the day of the Lord, 2 Peter chapter 3, the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. And we know he's talking about the final judgment here. And when he says that the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, what's he mean by that? Is it going to be a nighttime return? Is that what that means? That the Lord will only come back at night? Okay, yeah, people don't know when he's coming. Yeah, like a thief. I mean, right now, whose house is being broken into while you're away? Hope nobody. Watch it be me. My luck, I say that and go home and everything's gone. My luck. But we understand what he says is, okay, this is going to happen. And could it be tonight? Okay. Why do you say that? Because we don't know. Right. We don't know when it's going to happen. But we have to understand it's going to happen. The day of the Lord will. And you can look at that word and see how it's used so many times in 2 Peter 3 and verse 10. It will come. And it will pass, this heavens will pass away, elements will melt with fervent heat, and the earth and the works that are in it will be burned. This is going to happen. God's warning us again through his writings about his judgment. And so, just like he did through Joel and all these other prophets, we can see it's going to happen with us. But the thing is, we just don't know. We got to be ready. And that's so important. That's what we're doing. That's why we're here. We're wanting to be ready. I don't know if you've been following any of this transition with Deion Sanders. I'm telling you, if you haven't watched that, you need to go watch this guy. He is phenomenal. I mean, you talk about a positive guy. But he's moving from one school to another as a head coach of a football team. But I was watching his press conference at the new school the other day, and this guy, I mean, he's something else. He's amazing. But he was like, because he still has to go back and finish a championship game at his former school. And he says now, he told the press conference this, and then he told the players at the new team, he says, you need to get ready because I'm coming. Okay, and he used that phrase over and over, I'm coming. And he says, now, if any of you are going to ask, well, when's he coming back? He says, you don't need to worry about that. I'm coming. Just know I'm coming. And he was telling the players, you got to get ready if you want to be on this team. He was telling the people, don't lose heart. It's going to happen. You need to watch. It's really good stuff. But that's what God's saying. When's it going to happen? Well, don't worry about it. Just get ready. I'm coming. You be ready. And if you want to be in heaven, you need to get ready. You want to be in eternity with me, you need to be getting ready, because the day of the Lord is going to come. Okay? And so that to me is a very important lesson we can see from Joel. Anything else on this before we move on? Okay. Well, continuing to look at the highlights of this book, and we'll delve a little deeper, as we go through the chapters. One point I think is really interesting is how God used other nations to judge his people, but also other nations, but especially his people. And what's remarkable is how God then judges the oppressing nation. He referred to Babylon as his servant, Nebuchadnezzar, as my servant, this king of this Chaldean nation. And so he used the strength of Nebuchadnezzar to judge his people in Judah. And yet, in Joel, it talks about how God would eventually judge the oppressing nation for their own wickedness. I will remove far from you the northern army, and will drive him away into a barren and desolate land, with his face toward the eastern sea. So, that to me is a pretty neat point. God can use nations. He has. He can use any nation for his will. And we must not think, well, he doesn't do that today, or he's incapable of doing that today. And I think that's a big, big mistake, especially in studying the prophets. You see, he can definitely act in the world to carry out his will. But even the nation he uses to judge another nation must still answer for their own wickedness, is what we see in this book. And that's a pretty impressive thought. All right, anything on that? Okay. Now, what you also see in looking at Joel is you're going to see a lot of similarity in the way Joel spoke and the way John wrote in the book of Revelation. A lot of parallels there in imagery. For instance, Joel mentioned how the moon would be turned to blood in the day of the Lord. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. So that's a pretty vivid thought, okay? Vivid imagery. Well, you look in Revelation, and the judgment that was about to happen at that time, as John made it clear that he was dealing with things that were about to happen. And even then, when those events happened, he brought up this phrase of the moon becoming like blood. So that's definitely a comparison to the way Joel was writing. Joel mentioned how God's judgment was going to be a harvest, and that there would be this pressing of grapes in the winepress. And you can read about the very same thing in Revelation chapter 14 on the grapes of wrath. That whole text talks about the grapes of wrath. And referring to God's judgment at that time and the oppression that would be happening whenever the events of Revelation were occurring. They've already occurred, I'll just tell you that, in terms of the predominant judgment. But still, the same thing. The great winepress of the wrath of God, and the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles. So, very, like I'm saying, it's very, very similar to Joel. And then what do you know? You look in Revelation, and one of the acts of judgment, or at least forms of oppression, that the people would be experiencing were locusts. And locust is a major thought in Joel. But in Revelation chapter 9, it talks about in verse 3 how out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to torment them for 5 months in verse 5, and so on and so forth. They will want to die because of the locust. And that's a real interesting study in itself and what was happening at that time. But I think these are some things you can think about going into this book that can, help it stand out a little bit more as we study it. Okay? So, I'm sorry, I thought I showed that. Okay. Did it not come up? Okay, I thought I showed it a while ago. I guess I didn't show it. All right. So, in looking at this book, we'll just start looking at a little bit of it right now. In chapter 1, okay, think of how severe of destruction was coming upon Joel's audience. Okay, so he says, "Hear this, you elders, and give ear, all you inhabitants of the land." So he's talking to the leaders of Judah as well as the people themselves. And here's what he says. "Has anything like this happened in your days, or even in the days of your fathers? Tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children, and their children another generation." So the question is, how severe of destruction was coming on Joel's audience? How severe is this destruction going to be? Okay, right. Something that would need to be passed down. That it's going to be something that was unique, right? I mean, this is going to be so severe, nothing like this has happened in your days or even in the days of your fathers. Something terrible. And Brian's right. This would be a revelation that would need to be kept alive and passing down to your children. So you see this. And we can see that eventually he is going to talk about their being led away into the Babylonian captivity. Okay? And this thing was so severe, the Babylonian captivity, that it purged them of their idolatry, these people. It was intense. But he would want his people to tell future generations about it. Now, can you draw any application from what he told them in those words? And is there any relevance in our life today, just in reading those few verses? What are some parallels we can make with that? What does God want us to do with His Word? Spread it, exactly. Starting with who, though? Our family, yeah. Our children. Let them know. And He's always been like this. He's always wanted His people to tell their family. But, that's a really good point right there, is that He wants us to tell our children, and at least them, He wanted to tell them to tell their children about what? Exactly. God's judgment. Why in the world do we have a book in this Bible itself? Why in the world do we have it filled with so many stories of God's judgment? Right? It's so that we can do what? Prepare, exactly. That we can realize that He's a holy God. He's loving, beyond love. We just went through that with Hosea. By word, He loves us. No doubt He loves. Great God. But He's also a God of judgment. And that's what we can see in looking at this, that He wants us to realize. Go back to these stories of God carrying out judgment and tell it to our children, tell it to other people, so that we can calibrate our thinking, that it can be in alignment with who God is in His righteousness. So, like I said, that's a very important point to make on the severity of the destruction that was coming. Okay? Anything else on that? Say it again, please. Oh. Yeah, fear is judgment, exactly. Right. Yeah, fear it. I mean, I've heard people say, well, when I get there, I'm going to tell him what I think. No, you're not. No, you're not. Everybody's going to be on their knees before the presence of God. But it's coming, and we need to prepare ourselves and prepare other people. This is coming. The day of the Lord's going to come as a thief in the night. Go ahead, Donna, did you have something? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Deuteronomy 6, tell it to your children. Every opportunity you have, rising up, lying down. But see, that's why they need to hear these Bible stories. Going back and just all these beautiful stories. They're there, and they shape judgment. And they shape our reverence for God. And He wants us to know that. Why didn't God just come down in person and warn these people, you better get it right, because I'm about to blast you? Well, He didn't do. He sent these prophets to convey that message so that people might act by faith, obviously. And the same thing is true today. Okay? Anything else on that? Okay. Well, like I said, a major player in this story are the locusts. And what picture is described regarding the locusts? And here's what it says. What the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust has left, the consuming locust has eaten. So what do you gather from that?
Sounds like there's nothing left.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, there's nothing left after this. Yeah. Complete destruction, right? Just total consumption from the locust. Somebody made this comparison. You can take it for what it's worth if you can see it. The chewing locust is the creature that just emerged from the egg. The swarming locust has its first skin and longer legs. Crawling locust, small wings to leap. Consuming locust is winged, complete destruction of land. So, level by level is what I see here. God actually carrying out His judgment on His people. And it's getting progressively worse. Okay? Because it's more and more consuming until there's final destruction of the land. Well, the natural question is, okay, well, is that a literal locust? I mean, was he talking about a literal, invasion of these insects, or was he talking about people? And it says in verse 6, well, first of all, verse 5, notice this. Awake, you drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the new wine, for it has been cut off from your mouth. So he's dealing with people who were given to drunkenness, okay? And so it impaired their judgment. But this is how they were living their days. They were just focused on turning to this stuff. Well, is there a parallel with that today? Does that still happen? Is alcohol still a problem today? Or narcotics even, we should say. And why do people turn to these a lot of times? Not saying you can't take a little wine for the stomach. That's not we're not getting into that, right? We're talking about people who are abusing these things for the reasons that are mentioned here. But why do people do that?
Sometimes like they're trying to escape
Exactly.
problems in their life that have been caused by sin.
Yeah. Right. Right. To escape and not think about certain things. And all it does is compound the problems, obviously. This stuff does. But yeah, it's to escape, certain thoughts and certain realities of life. Well, what God was telling the people there is, you better sober up because this is about to happen. And I'm about to take it all from you. And he says in verse 6 that a nation has come up against my land. Strong and without number, his teeth are like the teeth of a lion, and he has fangs of a fierce lion. He has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. He has stripped it bare and thrown it away. Its branches are made white. Now again, you might say, well, that can still refer to a nation of insects, and it could be. It could be. But you look at the story, and he talks about a people. great and strong, the like of whom has never been, nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. So a people. Well, that was Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was dominating the world. The Babylonians were. But see, God used them. God allowed them to rise to power to carry out His will. And He would do that with successive generations as well. So He has that power. Yes, did you have a...
I believe you're right. I believe it does have to do with people.
Yeah.
It points back to verse 5 when it talks about that cloud.
Yeah.
You think about people who are addicted to that. What happens when they don't get it? They're willing to do anything. They'll steal. They'll steal, rob,
Yeah.
may harm someone,
Yeah.
threaten them. That could be where that's pointing.
Mm-hmm.
Back to that, and that's what's happened because of that.
Yeah, that's true. You know, the way it does overtake people and cause them to do, you know, harmful, irrational, dangerous, foolish, sinful things, wicked things, when a person is overtaken by that. Yeah, so I mean, that's a reality, and it's still the reality of our world. Drinking and drunkenness and so on and so forth, it's always going to be here. So it was affecting God's people then, okay? And He was going to wake them up, and He was going to use these locusts to do that. Now here's what you can possibly think about with this. You know, the chewing locusts, again, the stages of God's judgment against His people, maybe it refers to what we just looked at, you know, with Hosea. Israel being taken into Assyrian captivity. That's what Hosea was warning about, you know, and what was coming up to it. The swarming locusts, maybe this is the first group of people from Judah who were taken to Babylonian captivity eventually in 606. And then the third stage, probably it was referring to that second group from Judah that was taken, which would have been the third stage of God's judgment against His people as a whole. And then the fourth one would be the consuming locust. When that third group was taken, I mean, this whole nation was decimated. The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed. Their capital was just obliterated. So, you know, maybe that's what he is talking about in these different stages with these locusts. But what's the big point of all this? What do you think God is trying to get people to see in this story? Or what are some points, I should say, God's trying to get people to see from this story? Okay, the earthly stuff is temporary, that's true. It won't last. It won't. The earth, as we saw, and its works are going to be burned up. We read that already in 2 Peter chapter 3. The earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. So everything's going to be burned up one day. Everything. That's true. Any other point? Oh, sorry, Daryl. Yeah. Yeah, that there you have to answer. And God holds people accountable, and there's a punishment that He extends for rebellion, okay, and for people who will not listen. I mean, my word, certainly that's a connection we can make with a story like this. All right, anything else come to mind? Yes, Dale. Okay, right. Yeah, wake up. Yeah, I mean, that's for real. We do need to wake up. I mean, let's just assume the Lord's coming back tonight at 9:15. And it may happen. I mean, we really do not know when the Lord's coming back. But if people really, really believe that, how differently would things be? I mean, really, if you really believed it. You know what I'm saying? If we really believed it, we would act differently, right? We would respond, we would prepare because He's coming. It's like the Lord's coming. Well, what we can see in a lesson like this is God eventually does carry out his judgment. You can see that. He eventually does. Even against his people. He eventually judged. And it's complete. Okay? You know, he's not going to forget anything on the final day. And he's not going to overlook anything on the final day, or even when we leave this world. You know, when we're going to be judged eventually for that which we have done in the body, whether it be good or evil. God knows everything. And he is very capable of carrying out a thorough judgment against anybody. So, you know, I know that's not the message people want to hear today. I understand that. I don't always like talking about or even thinking about the judgment of God. But my word, you cannot read the book of Joel and really all these prophets without God's message of pleading with his people to repent, because there is a day of reckoning, okay? And so you see that here, and we've gotten a whole lot farther than I thought we would, so I don't have charts for what we're about to go through right now. Anything else before we move on? Okay. He goes on to say in verse 8, lament like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the husband of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering have been cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn who minister to the Lord. The field is wasted. The land mourns, for the grain is ruined. The new wine is dried up. The oil fails. So what we see from that is the things that people trusted in, okay, that people turn to so often to use against God are eventually taken away. And to me, that seems very relevant to today. What are people using today against God? What are some things people use against God? Their bodies, okay. There you go. True. The strength and ability and choices. That's a good one. What are people using against God today? Technology. Big time. Yeah, I mean, any new discovery, it doesn't take long, right, for it to be twisted and misused and corrupted. Certainly. Well, I don't even want to think about the stuff that's happening nowadays with technology, but yeah, definitely used against him. What else would you say? Yeah, prosperity, money in general, the abundance. And, God lets us enjoy blessings in life because he loves us all. He does. And he showers blessings on all of us. I mean, it does talk about how he causes his sun and the rain to come on the wicked and the just both, right? I mean, he loves all of us. But eventually, he's going to hold us accountable for how we use the things he blesses us with, because he's left evidence of himself with the abundance. But we eventually have to answer to him for how we use these things against him. All right, so think of this. In Romans chapter 1, when God is describing the corruption of man, and he's going through this, and he's talking about people who could see God, and his invisible attributes are clearly seen. You can see that we live in a world that it takes life to produce life, and there's too much order and everything around us to show design. So his invisible attributes are clearly seen, from reasoning to love to all the different things within us, being understood by the things that are made in verse 20, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, is what he says. The people are without excuse. In verse 21, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. You see? Why do we, as a people, why do we become corrupt? How does that happen? Although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, You see? As soon as we stop recognizing him as the giver of all that is good and realizing that life comes from him, when that happens, and then people start to worship themselves or change the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, then we digress and corrupt ourselves as a people. And all the things we use against him are going to be taken away. Eventually, it's going to be taken away. And that's what he was telling his people. The field is going to be wasted. All these things are going to be taken from you, and the land is going to mourn. Okay? So that is still a reality today. Anything else on that before we move on? Okay. Is it warm in here? Is it humid? No? Man, I don't know. There's nothing we can do about it now, but it's a little warm to me. All right, in verse 11, be ashamed, you farmers, wail, you vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished. The vine is dried up, the fig tree is withered, the pomegranate tree, the palm tree also, and the apple tree. All the trees of the field are withered. Surely joy has withered away from the sons of men. Now, you think about that for a second. What if you woke up tomorrow and all the trees were gone? All the trees were gone. What would happen to us if all the fruit trees, he mentions fruit trees here, but even the palm, what would happen if all these trees are taken away tomorrow? Okay, yeah, it would affect our life. Yeah. I mean, we need trees, obviously, to breathe. But what would happen to us as a nation if all of our trees were taken away? Or as he mentions here, the wheat and the barley, so on and so forth, what would happen? Yeah, that's true. You'd have a food crisis. No, we wouldn't. We'd just go to Walmart and get more. That's all we have to do. Go to Walmart. I mean, what would we do for real if all the crops were gone? Yeah, we'd starve. But we wouldn't have, right? We wouldn't be abounding. We certainly wouldn't be able to just live as if God wasn't a factor. We would be totally dependent from the poverty, and, we would just be people incapable of living, is the point. And we have to understand the God who told his people that is the same God we serve. I mean, God has the ability. Can he not do that tomorrow? Take everything away from us. He has that ability. So why would he do this to his people then? What was his point? He wants them to focus on him. Exactly. Get back to the origin of their relationship, to focus on him, to have that relationship with him and not be distracted by the things of the world. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody's a prophet today in predicting what's going to happen to this nation or that nation or our nation. But I do know what we need, right? We need God's mercy. Everybody needs God's mercy. And so we need to be people who depend on him and plead with him and ask him, what if we are the reason he spares this nation? Because of the prayers of his godly people, the people who are trying to do what is right in the world. That's what we do. I mean, we're salt, right? Salt preserves goodness and godliness, and that's who we are. But we have to understand, we live and breathe by his mercy. It's by his mercy. We're never independent of God and on our own apart from him. All right, friends, so we'll pick up in chapter 1 and just keep going and looking at various things and go from there. Thank you so much for your attention.